Hi everyone, and welcome to this video titled Self-Report Measures, Tools Used in Research Designs. In this video, we'll be discussing various aspects of self-report, informant report, and survey measures. First, what are self and informant report measures and surveys? Second, what are the two characteristics for evaluating measures? Third, what are the advantages and disadvantages of self-report and surveys? 4, what are the strengths and limitations of informant or observer report measures? And finally, we'll end with a review. What are self and informant reports and surveys? Self and informant reports and surveys are tools. They're tools that psychological scientists and clinical psychologists use to gather information about a person. Self-reports and surveys are when a person answers questions about themselves. Informant reports are when someone answers questions about another person. Self-informant report measures assess various characteristics that we care about. Personality, mental health, or just interests. Surveys are different because surveys ask about a person's opinions or attitudes. Those can be included in self-reports. This gets kind of murky, but in general, for our purposes, we're going to kind of separate them, whereas self-reports is more so asking the person explicitly about themselves, again, the personality, mental health concerns like depression and anxiety, or just their interests, whereas surveys are usually asking people things about their preferences. Do you think that this policy is a good or a bad choice? What's your religious affiliation? Those kind of things. It's important to remember that not all measures and surveys are created equal. The way that we phrase questions can influence whether a measure is an effective tool or not. And some survey takers may misunderstand questions. So, we assume that everybody is understanding the question in the same way. But if a lot of people aren't, that could really bias the results that we get. And we'll flesh this out a little bit more. What are the two characteristics for evaluating measures? The two primary characteristics that we should be asking about when determining if a measure, a self-report measure, an informant report measure, a survey, these kind of things, if they're effective, we should be asking about data and evidence regarding two key characteristics. The first is reliability or precision of the instrument, and secondly, the validity, the evidence of validity. This can be a very complex topic. There are entire courses about each one of these aspects, as far as statistical reliability and precision, and as far as research design reliability and precision. But for our purposes, we're just going to keep it really basic. Reliability is the consistency of a measure, or the precision of a measure. There are various indices or indexes of reliability. Reliability is a heterogeneous concept, if you will. So for example, what I mean by that is we have different types of reliability and evidence of reliability that we could have for a measure. For example, one thing we would want to know to determine if a measure is effective might be test-retest reliability. Test-retest reliability is determining the extent to which a measurement yields similar scores within a group of people over time. Test-retest reliability is very important if we're talking about stable traits or attributes. For example, if we claim that personality by definition is a relatively stable way that people think, feel, and behave and interact with the world, Well, we would want to see pretty high test-retest reliability for a personality measure. Okay? Another type of evidence of reliability for a measure, a self-report measure, informant report measure, survey that we may be interested in, is inter-rater reliability. That's the extent to which different people who maybe conduct an interview, for example, or make behavioral observations agree on the same characteristic. Now, I'm kind of mixing some terms together here. I'm talking about inter-rater reliability as far as on tests, in measures. So does my report of my depression symptoms match what my therapist sees as my depression, right? Like we would kind of look at that, or a few different psychologists, do their scores and responses match to each other when they're rating me about my depression, symptoms, for example. But we can also think about inter-rater reliability again as far as just judging maybe a behavior. Maybe we're looking at judging helping behavior of children on a playground, and we could decide that maybe a child helping another child up after they've fallen on the playground would be a form of helping behavior. We could have 2, 3, multiple people observing children play, and then we can see if they rate the same child the same way. So they could all identify a specific child. Are they rating them the same way? If they are, we'd say it's high inter-rater reliability. If people are inconsistent, it'd probably be low inter-rater reliability. So those are just 2 examples. There's various types of evidence for reliability, but those are just 2. The second key concept that we want to know about determining, like, is our measurement tool, for example, using a self-report or an informant report, if it's effective, is the evidence for validity. Okay, so we've got reliability is one aspect, validity is the other. Validity is the extent to which a measure assesses what it claims to measure. What does that mean? Well, let's say that we have a self-report measure of depression. For example, the Beck Depression Inventory 2nd edition is a widely used self-report measure of depression. They're claiming that it measures depression. So in order for it to be valid, the questions, the scores have to be related to depression. So, when we think about depression, the things that we know is people with depression tend to report feeling sad, blue, or depressed. They tend to report sleeping more or less than typical. They tend to experience symptoms of increased appetite or decreased appetite. They tend to report symptoms of thinking about death a lot, right? So validity is, are we measuring, to what extent are we measuring what we're saying we're measuring? Okay? So example, again, if you claim that you're measuring anxiety, or if a tool, a self-report, informant report, is saying that it's measuring anxiety, it should probably measure anxiety. Now, reliability is necessary for validity, but it is not sufficient for validity. What does that mean? In order to be valid, we have to continuously and precisely measure the same thing. Okay? But what can happen is we may be reliably, consistently measuring the wrong thing. For example, maybe we're trying to measure depression, but maybe we're actually measuring anxiety. So the measure would be reliable for depression, but it'd be an invalid measure of anxiety. It's measuring the wrong thing. It's measuring something consistently, that'd be the reliability aspect, but it could be invalid. So reliability and validity go hand in hand. You must have reliability in order to have validity. But just because you have reliability does not mean you have validity. Again, you could be consistently measuring something incorrectly. What are the advantages and disadvantages of self-report measures and surveys? Well, the advantages of using these tools, especially when you're using them within research designs, is that they're pretty easy and cheap to administer. You know, you could print out hundreds of copies of surveys, of self-reports, and you could hand them out to a group of people, and maybe they got 5 questions on them. So they're pretty easy, they're pretty cheap, they don't take a lot of effort just besides thinking about your responses, and you can collect a lot of data quickly. The other advantage of the self-report surveys is that they directly assess a person's state, how they think, feel, and behave, either at that time or trait across time. You know, we're asking people exactly what they think, and most people can accurately report how they think, feel, and behave. And this relates to the third point of the advantage. Self-report measures, though they have their flaws and their limitations, which we'll talk about, self-report measures, surveys, these kind of things tend to be highly accurate. Some of them tend to be highly accurate. Some of them not so much. Again, you need to look at the evidence for reliability and validity. But in general, self-report measures are pretty effective for gathering lots of data about people within a research design. But there are some limitations, right, with self-report measures. One, we're assuming that people have insight into their personality characteristics, for example, you know, the way that they tend to think, feel, and behave, and that they can report these things accurately. You know, what a lot of psychological science has shown us is that we tend to be good at reporting some things, but there's a lot of things that happen outside of our awareness that we're not as good at reporting. We can be confused, we can be, or just not be aware of the way we think, feel, and behave sometimes. That is possible. The second limitation and thing that we should be considering is that these measures assume participants are honest in their responses. What can happen sometimes is what are called response sets. That is, these are ways that sometimes people can distort their responses. One type of distortion is called social desirability, or what we could call presenting yourself in a positive light. Sometimes people over-report their virtues and or under-report their limitations. They may deny either being fully aware or not necessarily consciously. They may deny the problems that they have, for example, in a clinical setting. Another thing that we can see sometimes, another limitation that can obscure some results is what's called malingering. That is, sometimes people intentionally distort and exaggerate their difficulties. For example, in a clinical sense, let's say a person commits a crime. They believe that if they utilize the insanity defense, that they'll get a lesser sentence. The insanity defense is rarely used in criminal context, but some people do use it, and some people are found to be, not responsible for their crime due to insanity or mental health concerns and these kind of things. But what we're saying is, let's say that a person commits a crime, meet with a psychologist, they're evaluated about their, characteristics, they're given a self-report measure, and the person, the results suggest that the person might have schizophrenia, for example. And, because they weren't in their right mind at the time of the crime, maybe they get a reduced sentence. The person intentionally lying about or distorting that they have schizophrenia would be a type of malingering to receive some benefit. That is, to get a lesser sentence. So what I'm saying is sometimes with self-reports, some people can be inaccurate in their reportings. A lot of sophisticated clinical tools actually have validity scales, so we can fairly confidently detect when people's results are distorted. What are the strengths and limitations of informant report measures or observer report measures or observations? Well, the strengths are sometimes because people are unaware of their behavior, an observer or an informant may have better data, or maybe more accurate in their reporting. So, for example, to go back to our example of someone being charged with a crime, maybe we can learn more about them by having their family member fill out a rating scale about that defendant's behavior. It can help determine if behaviors occur across situations or are specific. Maybe sometimes that the behavior just occurred in that situation, but other people don't see that behavior. Other people aren't seeing those things. That could give us some discrepant information. Or, if multiple people are seeing symptoms, that can help us kind of confirm a diagnosis, for example, like ADHD. ADHD is a behavioral disorder, so other people should be seeing signs of disorganization, of difficulty keeping appointments, difficulty remembering things, right? Some limitations on self-report scales are what are called the halo effect and the Horn's effect. What does that mean? The halo effect. Sometimes when we ask people to rate another person's behavior, they can distort it. The halo effect is the tendency of ratings of one positive characteristic to spill over to influence the ratings of other positive characteristics. For example, the psychological research consistently shows that people who are perceived as more physically attractive tend to be rated as kinder, smarter than maybe what they actually are. So we know that just by one positive characteristic, we sometimes overgeneralize the positive attributes of a person, and that can distort our perceptions and our ratings. The Horn's effect is the opposite, where one negative characteristic may blind us to the person's total attributes. So, for example, maybe there's someone who is rude to you once, and then you're asked to rate their behavior, and then you just rate them as unintelligent, rude to everybody, etc., when that may not be the case. So we've got to be careful and looking out for the halo and the Horn's effect. But again, informant reports work pretty well. So what did we discuss? We discussed self and informant reports and surveys. They assess characteristics about a person. Evaluating the reliability and validity is key in determining if we have a good tool. The advantages of self-reports and surveys is that they're easy, pretty cheap, they work pretty well. Disadvantages are they assume people have insight into their behavior and are responding honestly. The strengths of informants reports is we get data from other people who know that person really well, maybe, for example, like a family member. And limitations of the informant reports are the halo and the Horn's effect, where one positive attribute of a person may cloud a judgment. So, for example, physical attractiveness, people who are physically attractive tend to be rated more positive on other characteristics when that may not be true. And the opposite, one negative characteristic may cloud an informant's judgment, and people may rate them negatively on various characteristics, regardless of that's true. Thank you for watching this video. Send me some emails if you have any questions. Thank you.